Blokus is a game made up of strategy, tactics, and luck based on what your opponents can play. Most people would think that there is no specific way to be Blokus, as it relies on your choices as well as the moves of those around you. But really, there are certain strategies that you can use to put yourself at an advantage. In this video, I will explain the best moves and tactics you can employ to get ahead of the Blokus competition, including starting moves, overall piece placement, as well as the psychology of your opponents. So, here's how you can win Blokus every time. First, control the center ground. Every player's first place piece must cover a corner square. So, in any game, no matter how many players there are, the board is going to be filled from the corners. When you think about how the pieces will build out from the corners, this means that at the start of the game, each player owns a specific section of the board and begins to expand from there. Head along one side of the board and you'll run into one player, but head along the other side and you will find another opponent. To move towards your third opponent, you would need to head straight across the board as they are directly opposite you. In terms of how territories overlap, the most hotly contested area is therefore going to be in the center of the board, which is the only place where all four people at the table are going to run into each other. Moving in one direction or another will certainly put pressure on one or maybe two players, but the only way you're going to be stealing placements from everyone else at the table is by moving to the middle of the board. This way, every placement you make not only benefits you, but has the possibility of getting in the way of all three of your opponents, and that is the ideal situation to be in. Even with fewer players, the center of the board is valuable simply because at the start, it is open on all four sides, so get in there and mark out your territory. Secondly, use larger pieces at the beginning. It sounds obvious, but is easy to overlook. At the beginning of the game, when there is a large amount of space on the board, you should be looking to place your biggest pieces. By the time everyone has crept towards the center of the board, things are going to be tight, so you should be saving your smaller pieces for the late game. This is also important because you lose points at the end of the game for each piece that you have not been able to place, and the bigger pieces will cost you more points. Another benefit of thinking big early on is that you can get into the center quickly and start causing problems for your opponents. Combine this with the tip above and it will immediately improve and set you up for a strong ending. Next, steal corners from your opponents. By doing so, you limit the options they have on their next turn and force them to make weaker moves than they want to. Better still, if they have kept some of their larger pieces, you might be able to prevent them from being able to place them on the board, and that is always worth doing. By keeping your own options open and shutting down your opponent's choices, you'll be able to tip the odds in your favor and begin to exert control on what happens next on the board. The power of the single square. Most obviously of all, if you manage to place all of your pieces and the single square is the last one you put onto the board, then it's worth 5 points in addition to the 15 you score from having placed everything. However, if you find yourself in a tricky situation, then that single square can prove useful in the middle of the game, as it's especially good at getting you out of difficult spots. For example, if you find yourself blocked into a certain area of the board, then a careful placed single square can enable you to break out into new territory. It can also offer an unexpected bonus because it can have as many as 3 corners free when you place it, and that means multiple possibilities for your next move. Of course, you probably won't have all these corners available to you if things have become tight, but it is still a very useful piece. And finally, watch your opponents carefully. Always keep an eye on where your opponents are building, but also which pieces they have left in their supply. As long as it fits together nicely with your overall aims, you can move towards them and block their progress, especially if you can work out in which direction they are looking to expand to. By leaving them space, you are giving them options, and you should be avoiding this at all costs. But if you have an eye on which pieces they have left, then you can interfere from afar. Really advanced play involves playing a piece that happens to block off one or more of the spaces an opponent would have needed for their next placement. Especially later in the game, if your opponents have been foolish enough to keep some hold of their large pieces, you can effectively lock them out of the game by shutting down their options until there are none left. As such, it goes without saying that you should always be keeping an eye on the board, but combine it with what is going off the board and you can really sharpen your game up.